What's going on, everybody? It's Tanner Lee of the Kicking Out Podcast, and I'm here with a name you know, New York Times best-selling author, writer for Inside the Ropes magazine. He's been a TV producer for about every cable network you can think of. Keith Elliot Greenberg is joining us once again. Keith, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tana. It's a pleasure to be here once again.
Yes, we interviewed you last year about your book, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. And now you just came out with a new book, which I got right here in my hands. Just finished it today. Really enjoyed it. Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. There's the book for everybody watching on YouTube. And I got to say, I love the cover. How did you come up with the title and the cover art?
Well, it was a while before I came up with the title. And I was making a list of potential titles every time I came across a saying or like a buzzword, an expression that was pertinent to the COVID-19 era. And, it was an era where people were feeling fairly fatal. So when Bray Wyatt invoked the words, follow the Buzzards, and I can't even remember the match. It might have been before his WrestleMania 36 match with John Cena. I thought, yeah, that kind of feels right, especially at that point. The world was so locked down that you had a WrestleMania that was largely from an empty performance center and pre-recorded. So it's like, yeah, follow the Buzzards, like the Buzzards are circling overhead. Where's it going to lead us? And at that point, I didn't know where it was all going to lead us because so much was uncertain, and I was writing the book as we went along, which I've never really done before.
Yeah, then that I think the title fits the book perfectly. In the cover art, I mean, you can tell it's Bray Wyatt without being exactly Bray Wyatt, I should say.
Well, it's a representation that may have been inspired by the Fiend.
There you go. Was the cover art designed by the same artist as your previous book?
There's a graphics company, an art graphics company up in Toronto.
Okay.
They do a lot of work with ECW Press.
Okay.
And yes, they did the last book. And the understanding between myself and ECW Press and that group was that this is a sequel. And so the covers, if you put them next to one another, they would seem part of the same series.
Oh, fantastic. I'll have to do that on my bookshelf. I'll have to put them next to each other so it's part of the same series.
Yeah, facing everybody as they walk into your apartment.
Exactly. Now, one question I had for you about writing this book is, how much of a challenge is it to write a book like this that is over a short period of time, covering a short period of time, contrasted to, say, someone's autobiography, like the Ric Flair autobiography you wrote?
It's a big challenge. Now, Ric Flair was a big challenge because Ric Flair had such a vast career.
Sure.
That if I had written his entire wrestling autobiography, it would be about 3,000 pages at least. And, Ric Flair would wrestle sometimes twice a day when he was NWA champ. And then I think I might have pushed a lot of viewers away because, nobody wants to, read it. I mean, some people want to read the encyclopedia. I personally have co-written 2 versions of the WWE Encyclopedia.
Mm-hmm.
And even there was an emphasis on brevity in certain sections. This was very different. Generally, you work on somebody's autobiography and there's an entire timeline that you can create beforehand. Now, I worked off an outline. I always do, because I always say the outline is harder than the actual writing. It's organizing the book. If you just wing it and start writing a book, you might find yourself lost in the middle of the forest. However, we didn't really know where this story was going to end. And I even acknowledged that in the book. Like, at first I was thinking, well, maybe by January 2021, this whole thing will be over. That'd be
Right.
nice and compact. We have COVID. It's there's a crisis, and then a vaccine is developed, and then live crowds return. Everything goes back to normal, and now we can ponder the lessons of the story. In this case, things weren't really quite back to normal. Now, January of 2021, we did have vaccines already. Not everyone was vaccinated, and there were not not indoor wrestling shows yet. Well, there were some, like in Japan. New Japan came back, but they had after a long sabbatical, but they had Wrestle Kingdom, instead of, say, 20,000 fans in the building, and I don't know the exact numbers, it was more like 4,500 fans in the building because of social distancing, and the fans were not allowed to cheer because there was a fear of bacteria being spread in the air, even though people were masked. Those are not normal circumstances. Those are still pandemic circumstances. And I was juxtaposing what was going on in pro wrestling with what was going on in the wider world. So I'm in London right now. Brexit was one of the things that was going on. We had the American presidential election going on. And so you had Wrestle Kingdom in Japan. And then the next day in Washington, D.C., there was the Capitol insurrection. And it's like, okay, this story is not going away. Like this is a book that's still unfolding. And I acknowledge that in the book. Like, that's what went through my head. So I'm riding it for a little while. Where is this all going? And then I went to WrestleMania. And WrestleMania, there was social distancing imposed. About 30,000 plus of the spectators you saw on TV were actually wooden cutouts in Raymond James Stadium in Tampa. Again, that's not 100% back where we should be. And, I'm used to WrestleMania with the Japanese fans and the Australian fans and the German fans. And this time it was largely fans from the Northeast, or rather the East Coast. Some had driven down from New York and New Jersey, and a lot had driven down. Like, there wasn't a lot of, flying that I heard about. And so again, it didn't quite feel like we were back yet. And at a certain stage, I said, I have to draw a line and say, we're getting to this point, and then, I'm finishing the book because the publisher wants the book out. And I was getting a little exhausted, just like waiting for the story to end. So, the book starts on January 1st, 2020, with a trip I took to AEW. January 1st, 2022, WWE has a pay-per-view or a premiere event on New Year's Day. And Roman Reigns gets sick. And they very quickly change the main event around. And Brock Lesnar emerges with the title. And it still sets the table for WrestleMania. And essentially the lesson is the road to WrestleMania continues. COVID may be here forever. Pro wrestling isn't going away. And they're going to have to learn to live together. And that's the lesson of the story, I guess. At least, most people I know are not getting hospitalized and, dying from COVID anymore.
Right.
So, I just flew the UK and people weren't even wearing masks on the plane.
Right.
So, I was just walking around in London tonight because over here it's about 3 a.m. And, there were people from all over the world walking around. So to me, this feels like the post-COVID era, even if COVID still exists.
Right. It's something we're just going to have to get used to. I mean, it's not, like you said, it's not going anywhere, and pro wrestling is not going anywhere. And that was shown in this book. And there were so many, even though it's hard for me to go back and watch pro wrestling, especially in 2020. Compared to 2021, not so bad when we were starting to get some crowds, but 2020, I still can't go back and watch WrestleMania 36, for instance. I just I haven't got there yet.
I've been having this talk pretty much on every interview, and even when I'm not on the air, like I'm going on Busted Open Radio next week. And so Dave LaGreca, the host, and I spoke on the phone tonight just to like confirm what date I'll be on and what time it will start and so forth. And then he actually gave me a very nice blurb that's on the back cover of the book. Yes. So he's read the book already, and he told me he's rereading it, which is very nice. And, so we were just chatting about, what's in the book. And he said, I just can't watch WrestleMania 36. It's just too recent. It's too real. It's too upsetting. And right now, we think of WrestleMania 36 as something that's a bummer to watch. And compared to wrestling we know, it's unwatchable. But, we were wondering, somewhere in the world, there was a kid who was 9 or 10 at the time and was a big WWE fan. And that kid is going to be 35 one day. And he's going to say, wow, remember when Braun won the title from Goldberg at WrestleMania? And I got to see Goldberg wrestle, even though he was in his 50s. I got to see that legend. And you remember Drew McIntyre winning the championship after winning the Royal Rumble? And that's going to be the standard this kid applies to all wrestling. Just like me being a 63-year-old man, I compare everything to Bruno Sammartino and Jack Briscoe, who I was fortunate to see defend the NWA title when I visited relatives in Florida. And, somebody in their late 30s will compare everything to the Attitude Era. Right. And somebody 10 years older than that will compare everything to the Rock and Wrestling Connection. And, you fall in love with wrestling at a certain age, and perhaps 20, 25 years from now, people will look at that WrestleMania and they might enjoy even watching it because it's a snapshot of what pro wrestling was during a very unique time. And I'm hoping that they can read the book and that the book will still have some meaning. Obviously, there will have been lessons learned that we haven't learned yet and haven't been included in the book. But I'd like to hope that people will read it and say, this guy didn't really get it so wrong.
No, and I think that's a fantastic point you brought up. I envision myself down the road maybe watching WrestleMania 36 back with my kids.
Right.
Showing them, hey, look what happened here in 2020. And they'll just be amazed. They'll be amazed. Their jaws will probably hit the floor because hopefully they don't have to go through anything like that in their lifetime. But
right. I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, it's like, I wasn't alive during World War II. My father was. My late father was. But, World War II, when my father was serving in the military, baseball went on in America, but all the best players were, in uniform.
Right.
So that's why you had a one-arm player on the Cleveland Browns. And, I was always very curious about that era because who were these guys who were basically 4F? They were incapable of enlisting in the U.S. military. They were the guys who were playing baseball. Right. And I guess they were playing for the kids who were too young to serve. And, I would imagine that in the early 50s, the veterans would not have wanted to have seen those games. But certainly there was somebody who was 10 years old at the time that would have been thrilled to see those games again.
Right. Yeah, very good comparison there. Very good comparison. And that is the beauty of professional wrestling. It kind of, it's been an escape for so many of us for different things throughout our lives. And come 2020, when in March, especially when the world came to a halt, that was still escape for a lot of us. And even though it was weird and it was hard to get used to watching without crowds or limited crowds, it was still something we could look forward to every week.
Right. I mean, and it was a mixture because it was escape and it was something that was guaranteed, and it was something new. And yet at the same time, we couldn't forget that what was going on in the bigger world.
Right.
When you are like, if you remember, first they're in the performance center,
Mm.
and you can see the empty seats,
Right.
and then they move the ring closer to the stage. And I remember like an indie guy saying to me, he goes, "Man, like we have a bigger entrance ramp than they do now, a longer entrance ramp than they do now." But of course, he was shut down. He was completely shut down. Like no one was coming to his shows.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but you were still aware that there was nobody there. And then, the Thunderdome occurred. And I think the Thunderdome, that actually did make me forget that there weren't crowds over there. And I think that AEW did a very successful job by posting wrestlers, scattering them in the crowd at Daly's place, which happens to be an amphitheater and owned by the Khan family. And it felt like they were spontaneously reacting to what they saw in the ring. And it did feel like the old studio wrestling broadcasts. So, it did help us escape a little bit more. But invariably, people would come down with COVID, and we were aware of it. And there were lots of things going on. We had the Black Lives Matter movement going on, and that found its way into wrestling. You had, guys like Keith Lee and the New Day were wearing, tributes to African Americans who died in police confrontations on their gear. And it didn't so you didn't shut that out. And that's not fun stuff. Like when you bring in real world angles, sometimes it's usually in the spirit of comedy. This was different. And even if you recall, what was it, Retribution, that was all, they were almost like a takeoff on Antifa. I mean, it didn't really go anywhere. At first, I was like a little worried about it because the leader was Mustafa Ali. And I was really hoping that they weren't going to play up his ethnicity and make him into a villain and inspire that type of hate, which they did not. But there was definitely an undercurrent there. So again, those are real world circumstances intruding in wrestling, and not necessarily happy stuff that'll make you forget your day-to-day life.
Right. Very well put. And I'm glad you put that type of stuff in the book. I thought it was really interesting to read a book that not only was talking about wrestling in 2020, but the big real world events happening, from the election to the Black Lives Matter to this Speaking out. Thank you. Speaking out movement.
Yeah.
You incorporated all that in the book. And I honestly had never read a wrestling book that tapped into any of that. So I thought that was great.
Yeah, I mean, and I knew that I would get some negative reaction from that. Look, when I wrote Superstar Billy Graham's autobiography, a friend of mine said, "Why couldn't you just keep it to wrestling? Why'd you have to include so much about his liver transplant?" And so, there are some folks who feel that there's too much in there about what was going on in politics. I read something on Goodreads where someone said, like, why do you have to include Brexit? And I get my first review on Amazon, and the guy gives me 2 stars, and he goes, "The book is infused by Trump hate." I mean, that, first of all, I did try to be as objective as possible. And in my real life, in my full-time job, I work as a journalist, and I did try to make it journalistic. If by saying that a man lost the presidential election and was stubbornly insisting that he was still the president, much the way that Bob Backlund would stand outside of Madison Square Garden when Hulk Hogan had won the title, and people would say, you're the champ," and he'd go, "I still feel like the champ." If that means Trump hate, I wasn't intending to hate anybody. Right. I was just describing the absurdity of it all.
That's how I took it. So
Yeah.
I thought you did a great job covering all that. And I also like going back to the Too Sweet book. I like how you still, and I know you talked about you've got criticized by having some of the wrestlers that have been involved with the speaking out movement still in that book. I personally like that you kept them in there.
Yeah, because it's history.
Right.
You know, this was the history of the indies. And, you know, you only get a shot. You know, some people will read Too Sweet, and that will be the only time they really learn about the indie scene.
Mm-hmm.
And if suddenly I excise Joey Ryan and David Starr from there, I would be doing that history a disservice.
Right.
And I say this in this book, much the way that if I suddenly, you know, if I omitted Chris Benoit's name from the annals of pro wrestling in the time where he performed, well, then you'd know a lot less about ECW and WCW and WWE and New Japan because he played a significant role in those promotions.
Right.
And I didn't want to do that.
Right. Right. So I thought it made total sense. Total sense. So what was the initial plan for this sequel that ended up being Fall of the Buzzards before COVID hit? What was the plan coming off of Too Sweet? What was the plan in your mind? What were you envisioning for the sequel?
Well, when I finished Too Sweet, essentially ends with it's Joey Janela, Marco Stunt, Orange Cassidy, and Jungle Boy wrestle and Bryce Remsburg is actually here too, the referee. They're at a GCW show, Game Changer Wrestling show in Asbury Park. And then the four wrestlers get into a car and they're driving down to the first Dynamite. And, you know, that's how it ends. They're driving off to the new era in the indie wrestling revolution. And I thought, I'm not done telling this story. I'm done telling this, you know, chapter of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to the executive editor, Michael Holmes, that, yeah, I want to do a sequel. And he's like, yeah, you know, calls for a sequel. So, you know, I'd signed a contract and then COVID happened. And, you know, once we realized COVID wasn't just going to be a couple of weeks, because it would have been in the book anyway.
Sure.
Then I realized this is going to be a different book.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be about pro wrestling during the COVID era.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of waited to decide when it was appropriate to kind of end that story. And,
yes.
You know, and we agreed on that.
Yes. One interesting topic I like that you hit on the book was talking about, of course, how some of the wrestlers, especially the ones on the indies, were getting by during the COVID era, especially the likes of Danhausen.
Yeah, Danhausen, it's actually quite an inspiring story for all the griping about social media. Look, if it wasn't for social media, you and I wouldn't be doing this right now.
Correct.
You know, and my oldest kid is transgender and a filmmaker. And so, you know, I feel that Dylan has, you know, social media may have given Dylan life when Dylan was younger and plugged Dylan into a community. You know, and Danhausen had just recently quit his day job to devote himself to being Danhausen.
And I didn't know that, so I read the book. I mean, I like Danhausen, but I did not know what he had done previously before he turned into a wrestler.
Right. So he had given up his day-to-day job, and he has a family, and now he had to make money. And because he was Danhausen, he used social media, and he had Patreon and he had Cameo, and he was able to get people to log in, and he did a variety show with other people online. And, you know, no one knew what Danhausen was going to do. He did improv online. Everything was online, and he sold merchandise, and he supported himself. And because he had a captive audience, literally a captive audience, everybody was home. If you were a Danhausen fan, you didn't mind the couple of dollars that were coming out of your pocket to see Danhausen.
Right, right. And now look at him now. He's a full-time member of the AEW roster. So it's a pretty great story there. And it's wild to think back. A lot of these wrestlers have Colt Cabana and the Young Bucks to thank kind of for years prior for kicking off how to kind of merch,
Right.
sell
How
your
to,
brand,
how,
how to sell
how
your
to
brand.
monetize.
Monetize. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
How to monetize their indie fame. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and one thing I really like talking to you about is, of course, you're a pro wrestling historian. I mean, anything that's nostalgia, you can talk on it better than about anybody. But you also are a big fan of modern day wrestling.
And, a lot of people point that out because they're shocked that a guy in his 60s is a fan and can appreciate modern day wrestling, because they're expecting me to say it was better when Dominic DeNucci and Chief Jay Strongbow were wrestling. And look, in my mind, do I romanticize that time? Of course I do,
Sure.
because, it's just like you idealize the first girl you ever had a crush on
Right.
if you were heterosexual, or the first guy you ever had a crush on if you're not heterosexual. But, I'm still a wrestling fan, and I don't want to be a nostalgia act, and I don't want to be an old guy who can only speak about the past.
Right.
And so, I'm very fortunate to Inside the Ropes magazine here in the UK, because they were created as a newsstand wrestling magazine during the pandemic, time when print was supposed to be dead, and certainly people weren't going to be going out to the newsstand and buying wrestling magazines or ordering paper magazines to their home. But they immediately assigned me a monthly column. And so if I'm writing a monthly column for a wrestling magazine, they can't all be stories about George the Animal Steele and Killer Kowalski, much as I would love to indulge myself in that. And there's room for it sometimes. I think it's important to be aware of what's going on and appreciate what's going on, and accept that maybe some of the stuff that you see now is better than it was then. And not all of it, but a lot of it. And, wrestling evolves, just like when I was a kid, I never ate sushi because it was alien. Well, there are certain types of matches that I wasn't accustomed to seeing.
Sure.
And maybe sometimes, if you're a fan, you could benefit from watching some of the modern stuff.
Right. On the Kicking Out podcast, we're primarily a podcast that talks about AEW, but we harp and praise.
Hence the colors, I'm guessing.
Hence the colors. But we say all the time, watch what you want to watch, like what you want to like. There's too much hate out there on the IWC, almost cyberbullying each other and picking on each other because, you only watch AEW or you only watch WWE.
It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous.
When I was writing for the WWF magazines, there was Raw magazine and SmackDown magazine, and then there was the online department, WWE.com. And I wrote for them too. I didn't write for them as much, but there was like this tension between, new media, as it was called then, and publications. It's like, hey, we're all like in the wrestling business, which everyone makes fun of anyway. Like, those guys aren't my arch enemies. Like, we're all writing about wrestling.
Right.
So, we're all writing about WWE. So, like, we really are on the same team. But I think people are tribal by nature.
I think you're right.
I was just at Grand Slam in Queens last week. And I wrote I wrote a lengthy article for Inside the Ropes magazine about this. I was actually writing it on the plane coming over to the UK, because I went to the UK the day after Grand Slam, or the night after Grand Slam. And several of the people in the crowd said the same thing that you just said. They said, look, if one guy said to me, if someone put a gun to my head and said, WWE or AEW, choose one, he said he'd choose AEW. But no one's putting a gun to his head and saying that.
Right.
So why can't he appreciate both?
Yeah.
And why can't he be happy that the options have seemingly widened for professional wrestlers, the guys who break their bodies, sacrifice their health, compromise their relationships with their own families to entertain us? Why shouldn't they have choices, both financial choices and creative choices. And
Yes.
I'm all for that.
Yes, beautifully put. That is worded perfectly. And I think as wrestling fans, right now in 2022, it's a great time to be a wrestling fan. You
It
can
is.
find good wrestling any night of the week.
It is. And I'm going to say something else when you were asking me about, oh, you're an older guy, but you like, modern wrestling. I look at some of my friends and I'll see some of these guys this weekend because I'm doing a book signing in Queens, where I grew up. By the way, when is this going to be up? This interview?
It'll be up in a couple days, so
Okay,
probably by the 6th.
So people may be around. So October 13th, Thursday night, October 13th, everybody in the New York City area, you are invited to my release party. It is at Lucky 13, which is known as New York City's only metal bikini bar, and that is Thursday night, October 13th, starting at 8 p.m. It's my release party, and it's an open invitation. And when they say metal bikini bar, there are several dancers there. I never put my glasses on in front of people, but I did talk to the owner, and he said, Leah, Kiska, and Happy are the dancers that you will see on the pole that night. So, let me put them over. They are athletes on that pole. And then 2 days later, on Saturday, October 15th, I will be signing books at the Wrestling Universe, which is a great wrestling merchandise store on Francis Lewis Boulevard in beautiful downtown Flushing, Queens, which is where I come from. I have, a sleeve of Queens tattoos over here.
Very cool.
And, I'll be real happy to be there. But getting back to what I was saying, I'll see my friends, in particular, my friends John Diagardi and Jeff Steinmark, and those guys don't really watch the modern product. When I'm with them, we are talking about Chief Jay Strongbow and Dominic DeNucci and laughing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot for us to laugh about and remember. But there's a lot of stuff now that those guys would think is fun.
Yeah.
And, I wish that I could drag those guys to something like Grand Slam, or for that matter. Well, John went recently, over the last few years, he did go to a WWE show. But, there's something that, to enjoy and not just WWE and AEW. If you read the book, obviously, I'm quite partial to GCW,
right.
Game Changer Wrestling. And there's promotions all over the world now. I'm in the UK. I was in Glasgow the other day. There's, Insane Championship Wrestling in Glasgow. There's Rev Pro in London. There's Progress in London. There's a WXW in Germany. And, there's in Chicago Heights, there's Warrior Wrestling,
right.
which is fantastic. And I mentioned in the book,
yep.
And there's Fist in San Diego. And I'm leaving, Black Label Pro. I'm leaving so much out. I'm leaving so many promotions out, but all of those promotions are out there. And in many of these promotions, you will see top talent, and you will also see people who will be top talent very soon and will be on, regular TV very soon. So, if you love wrestling or ever loved wrestling, give this stuff a chance because, you deserve to be entertained like that.
Yes, there's something out there for everybody. If you were a pro wrestling fan, are a pro wrestling fan, interested in becoming a pro wrestling fan, there's something out there for you.
Right.
There's something out there for you. And speaking of the pro wrestling world right now in 2022, what if you had to, I guess, and I'm kind of backtracking on my topic we were just talking, if you had to only pick one promotion to watch, what kind of promotion interests you the most?
I don't know. I mean, that's not fair.
It probably isn't.
Because, look, let's look at ECW, okay? Which everybody, well, not everybody. Some people think it was, awful and,
right.
That it took wrestling in a shameful direction.
Mhm.
But let's look at ECW and assume that ECW's influence was by and large positive.
Okay.
You had great technical wrestlers. You
Mhm.
had Malenko and Eddie Guerrero going at each other in the middle of the ring. Actually, Dean Malenko will be next to me at the same signing at the Wrestling
Oh,
Universe
that'll be fun.
on October 15th. So, he'll be signing and I'll be signing, but, two different audiences, but maybe the same in some ways, same
Yeah,
sensibilities in some ways. But, you had these great technical performers in ECW. If you just wanted technical wrestling, there was a lot in ECW for that. And then there were crazy, insane death matches.
Mhm.
You had Mick Foley there, and you had Terry Funk there, and you had characters like 911 and the Sandman. I mean, there was a little bit of everything.
Sure.
And Paul Heyman was just trying to keep the ship floating, and couldn't, that was a struggle, but he delivered a variety. And I don't think we should pigeonhole ourselves
That's
by
fair.
saying one promotion, one type of promotion only.
That's fair.
And now we're fortunate that the talents of female wrestlers are finally acknowledged.
Mhm.
And, it's not uncommon to see women in the main event. And, in the recent, like last night on Raw, I was, the main event was leading to Bayley versus Bianca Belair. That was, the tease. And, it doesn't seem that long ago when the idea of putting two women in the main event on even a Monday Night Raw would be something historic.
Right.
It would be an experiment that maybe wouldn't work. And that isn't happening now. So, again, if you were watching wrestling in the past, you really missed what WWE labeled, the female, what they call it, the women's revolution or whatever
Yep.
it was called.
Mhm.
But, for all the hype, it did happen. And now it's accepted. And there are, all these really great female athletes out there. And, you're missing something if if you're not appreciating them.
Absolutely. And I remember watching live the Monday Night Raw where Trish Stratus and Lita became the first women to main event a Monday Night Raw.
Right. And, because of my age, and I was working for WWE at the time, it doesn't seem that long ago in my lifetime, even though it was. And I think it's very telling that Lita is the godmother of one of Trish Stratus's kids, because that means so much to both of them that they had that experience together. It's deeper than just wrestling. It's never, it's only wrestling. It's, it is life. For them, it is life. And that is what they gave to the world. And that is why Trish felt, of all the people on earth, she wanted Lita to be her child's godmother.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, and when we talk about that main eventing Raw, and then a few years ago, WWE had an all-female pay-per-view.
Right.
Which is hopefully the first of many to come, hopefully.
Right. And I mentioned Shimmer in the book, which is, an all women's promotion. And, and again, I mentioned the speaking out movement and, women's reaction to it. And I hope that, that women felt, there was a lot going on during the COVID era. And I hope that people come away from the book understanding, appreciating that there are great female wrestlers out there.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm glad the focus is starting to be on females as well as males, because at one time it wasn't like that. So, and you're a guy who's been to many wrestling promotions, events over the years. Is there any bucket list item that you still haven't checked off your wrestling fandom that you'd like to get to?
Yeah, I'm actually jealous of my friend Walt Schwenk, because Walt has been to WrestleMania, he's been to Wrestle Kingdom, and he was just at Aniversario in Mexico for CMLL. And yeah, those are on my bucket list: Wrestle Kingdom and Aniversario. Okay. And for that matter, Triple Mania.
Triple Mania too.
in AAA. Yeah.
Is there any arenas that you haven't been to that you'd like
Sure.
to?
I mean, let's see. I have been to Japan.
Okay.
Have I been in the? I have not been in the Tokyo
Tokyo
Dome.
Dome, that would be a big one.
I was
Okay.
in Yokohama, and I did go to Sumo Hall, which was quite a privilege. And yeah, there's the arena, and of course, I'm here. I am. I'm in London right now. It's the arena where Rev Pro does a lot of its shows, basically a nightclub.
Okay.
But I'd like to experience that, that atmosphere, just like I was fortunate to experience the atmosphere at that American Legion Hall where Pro Wrestling Guerrilla performed, in Reseda, California. And yeah, there's a lot of places. There's places that I may not have even heard of, but when you meet people from certain parts of the world, they tell you about just the intensity of the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, it's just like people who want to go to every baseball stadium.
100%. 100%. Yeah. I know a lot of people that's their bucket list. So that whenever I talk to a wrestling fan or somebody who covers wrestling for a living, that's a question I always like to ask because I'm just curious what's on everybody's list there. One person you mentioned in the book, and I want to know how many encounters you've had with this gentleman. He's a guy that's front stage right now in the world of AEW, Maxwell Jacob Friedman.
I haven't had a lot of encounters with him. When I was working on the indie wrestling book, I remember I was backstage at an MLW show, and we were both in the same room, and he was standing there, and Sammy Guevara was standing there.
Mm-hmm.
And like they wanted to be interviewed. They were kind of standing there and looking at me.
Uh-huh.
But I was, Brian Pillman Jr. was there and Teddy Hart was there. And, I didn't have, a lot of time. The matches were about to get started. And so I was interviewing, and Tommy Dreamer was there. And, I was going to those guys and I wanted to get to everybody. But then I remember Maxwell Jacob Friedman was in the first match and I missed him. I didn't get to talk to him. And so, he has done some stuff with Inside the Ropes magazine. His mother and I were in high school at the same time.
Oh, okay.
And we have one, good mutual friend. I don't remember ever having a conversation with her in high school. She may have been a year or two younger than me, but there were certainly times when we were likely in the same place because my best friend was going out with one of her friends. So
small world.
Small world. But I can remember going on Facebook and, you're like friends with all these people who went to your high school and like looking at like family photos, people put up these family photos. It's like, oh, that's a good looking family. And it's like looking a little closer. And it's like, is your son MJF?
Oh, that's great. That is great. But he is definitely a guy I have gained so much respect in just because in the world of social media, it's hard to stay in character if that's what you choose to do.
Like you posted something. It's a Jewish holiday now, or was. I'm over here and I'm not observant anyway. But he posted something about it's the Day of Atonement, which is the most austere holiday on the Jewish calendar. And he posts something about it. And then he says, and tune into Dynamite and watch me wrestle a schmuck. And there's a picture of him and Wheeler Yuta.
Yep.
Like he just, hits it every time.
Oh, every time. He never misses. I mean, he's going to be, the money wars of 2024, as he calls it. It's going to be interesting.
Right.
It's going to be interesting.
They already have some deal, but
True.
Who knows? It's for us to speculate.
Right.
I will say this. I don't like to talk about the negatives in wrestling, and the media scrum certainly is a negative thing that we can't ignore because we all saw it.
Oh
and
yeah.
you can't like take
Couldn't
it
couldn't
back.
believe what we were seeing, but we
I couldn't
also
believe what we were
oh,
seeing. Right. I mean, I mean, I tell this story over and over again.
mhm,
Like, I was, I was burnt out. Like, not burnt out. I was happily spent is a better way to put
mhm,
it. It was a great weekend. You had
mhm.
Clash at the Castle.
Yep.
You had a great NXT show.
Yep.
And then, all that was a really good show.
Mhm.
And my neighbor Lee Gaynor and we took an Uber back home from there's a wrestling bar called DDT in Brooklyn,
Okay.
which I highly recommend, although it's small. So if there's a big wrestling night, you may not get in. It's very exclusive. I'm not even joking about that, just because they can't fit that many people in there. And it's like the place where everybody wants to go and watch wrestling and talk wrestling, you know. And I Lee Gaynor and I are in the Uber, and we're just babbling about all the wrestling we saw, and we were tired and we'd been drinking. And
Uh-huh. Sure.
I go home and I go to sleep because I'm not going to watch the media scrum. I'm exhausted. I've been
Right.
watching wrestling all weekend, and it's like I'm thinking to myself, well, thank God I don't have a girlfriend, because all I wanted to do was watch wrestling, and I did it.
Uh-huh.
And I wake up, and I look. I've told this story before. I just wrote about it in my Inside the Ropes magazine column. I'm getting messages from my friends in the UK who are up before I am. And I start watching the media scrum, and at first I'm thinking, oh, big deal. So he's saying CM Punk is saying some stuff about Colt Cabana.
Mhm.
And then I just can't take my eyes off of it. So anyway, that all happened. Certainly, it's fair and objective to say it was very embarrassing for
Yes.
AEW and
Yes, it
Tony.
was.
Okay, that is not me being opinionated. That is me
No, it
stating
was
fact.
100%. 100%.
And then Dynamite occurs a few nights later, and MJF comes out, and he's starting to make us forget a little bit.
Mhm.
And the last couple of weeks, MJF has taken on this leadership role in pulling AEW up. Not to say there aren't great talents right there with him who've
Right.
been, manning the ship the entire time. All these great more than solid hands. These,
Mhm.
Other so-called generational talents.
Mhm.
They're all there. But having him back feels like a real spurt of energy.
Yeah, real big deal. And their shows have been really good these past few weeks. It's kind of like they've had to reset in some ways and shift focus a little bit. And one of those guys that, in my opinion, could be up for Wrestler of the Year this year is Chris Jericho.
Right.
And
yes.
right now, the Ring of Honor champion, as I did not have that on my 2022 bingo
No,
card.
I certainly would not have predicted that.
But how do you think the Ring of Honor acquisition and reintroduction has been going for AEW?
Well,
so far?
that's a good question. It's like writing about pro wrestling during COVID, in the middle of COVID.
Yeah.
That story hasn't ended yet.
Right.
They could end up with a weekly TV show.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Yep.
So it's a work in progress, and we're at the embryonic stages of the Tony Khan era of Ring of Honor. And, let's hope that Ring of Honor isn't buried like traditionally any acquired promotion would be, whether it was Jim Crockett Jr. buying the UWF or Vince McMahon buying, the assets of WCW.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm hoping. I still have faith that Tony will do right with it, but
Me too.
We will see how that goes. I think
he knows that history. He knows
does.
the same history we do, and he appreciates it.
He does.
So I'd like to invest in where he's going.
And I just said Chris Jericho would be up there for one of my
Wrestler of the Year, but
but
let's talk about Chris Jericho, because it's not just Chris Jericho that is and he's reinvented himself so
Right.
much.
Right.
That's what makes him one of the greats.
Mhm.
But let's also talk about the people who are getting the rub from Chris Jericho.
Mhm.
And let's look at guys like Drew Parker and Matt
Oh
Menard.
my goodness.
I
Yeah.
mean, those guys are fabulous.
Oh,
And having this spotlight on them, these are guys who might have been on Dark and Elevation. And these are guys I can't take my eyes off
no,
of now.
they're fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Those two, Daniel Garcia. He's
Daniel
one.
Garcia is so great. And
he's-
again, no one can deny that affiliation with
Right.
the Jericho Appreciation Society.
Right.
Launched Garcia to a level that he wouldn't be right now.
Yep.
Now, Garcia was always great,
Sure.
but you need to have a forum, you need to have a platform. And it's Chris Jericho giving him that platform. It's AEW, and it's Chris Jericho who's, you talk about getting the rub.
Mhm.
That's getting the rub.
Right. And kind of on the flip side, Wheeler Yuta is kind of getting the same
Right.
with the Blackpool Combat Club, with the
Right.
likes of William Regal, John Moxley,
Yes.
um,
And Brian Danielson.
Brian Danielson. Yeah.
I mean, that's, very heady company. And now Claudio
And Claudio,
Castagnoli.
yeah.
It's very heady company to be in. And I think we all agree Wheeler Yuta belongs there.
Yes, he does. Yes, he does. So, and you were just you're in the UK right now, like you said earlier in an interview, and you just did some events with William Regal. Am I not mistaken?
Yes, I did. And it's funny. William Regal, Inside the Ropes magazine is part of the Inside the Ropes franchise, which was started by Kenny McIntosh, the Scottish guy everyone's seen on YouTube, interviewing these legends of the squared circle. And what they will do is they will go to a theater or a nightclub, get a couple of hundred people in there, and essentially do a conversation, a back and forth with a legend. And I'm going to the RVD Q&A tomorrow. I'm here to, sign books.
Sure.
But I did that at 2 William Regal events earlier this week, one in Glasgow and one in Manchester. And it's funny, like when I went backstage after the Manchester event, Regal said, I looked into the audience, and he goes, boy, that guy looks a lot like Keith Greenberg, but why would he be in Manchester? It's ridiculous. But I'm going to say, listening to William Regal speak, the first night, William Regal essentially delivered what I'd call a seminar. And it was a seminar on what makes a great wrestler and how he came up, how he was trained, how he developed an ethic, how he became what was known in England then as an international wrestler. If you were a promising young wrestler, you went to Germany, and you went to France, and you went to Mexico, and you went to Japan, and you worked all over the world, and you developed your seasoning, and you took something of that style, and you worked a very believable British strong style, where you could grab somebody and put them in a torture hold and practically kill them. So he spoke a lot about that. He spoke a lot about his wrestling philosophy, and he spoke for long stretches without anybody interrupting him, and everybody in the audience, was just soaking in each word. The next night, he told funny stories. He told stories about, Ric Flair and him in a car and in a dust storm, and Ric Flair getting his white suit filthy and him screaming and his face turning red and, his eyes bulging and his face covered with dust. So, there were two very different shows, and I honestly found myself wishing that there was a third night with William Regal, because I wanted to see what he presented the next day.
Absolutely fascinating guy in the wrestling industry. Fascinating.
Yeah, and a guy who really is indispensable to the wrestling industry today because of his wealth of experience.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking before about me enjoying the modern product. it's in just like I learn from younger people in whatever I'm doing. There is something to be said for experience, and William Regal has that experience. And they're both the funny road stories, and his experience involves overcoming addiction problems, which was quite an albatross that professional wrestlers dealt with because of their painkiller dependency. And he has all of that varied training, and he was a scout for so many years for WWE, and that experience, there are very few like him, and that's why we're really fortunate that people like him are still involved in pro wrestling, because they can take that experience, find something magical in someone younger, and bring those people into the spotlight.
Well, another one of those people that is kind of like that in AEW is Arn Anderson. Hasn't been on TV near as much.
No.
Because of the guy he was a coach of. My personal current favorite pro wrestler, Cody Rhodes, jumped from AEW to WWE back in spring at WrestleMania 38. About 37, 38, yes. What were your takes on that? Was that a move that surprised you? And what do you think we foresee with Cody
I was
going forward?
surprised because Cody was so identified with AEW.
Yes. I mean, the smashing the throne.
Because if it wasn't for Cody and the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, there wouldn't be an AEW.
Right.
Tony Khan's money aside. So yes, it was surprising, and it just showed that nothing is in stone in this world.
Yep.
It also showed that nobody's stuck.
Right.
Nobody's stuck where they are, and maybe that should be something that's inspiring to everybody.
Yeah.
You're not stuck where you are. If you want better, go ahead and find better.
100%, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes when he gets back from his torn pec. Because it looked like he was going to be on a fun ride before his injury. So
yeah, I think it'll be pretty exciting when he comes back.
I would assume so. So yeah, I guess okay. So we got Too Sweet, and then we got Follow the Buzzards. What's next?
Well, you know what? I'm waiting to see.
Okay.
I wrote Too Sweet, and then I immediately started researching Follow the Buzzards because we were in the middle of COVID, and there was no time to waste. And there's a lot going on in professional wrestling now. It's Vince McMahon has stepped down. It's the Triple H era, which is a new page has been turned in WWE.
Honeymoon phase.
A new phase.
Yeah.
Thus far, it's very inspiring, but we're also in the honeymoon period, much like we were in the early days of AEW. Obviously, there will be a reckoning period where people will be online criticizing some of Triple H's decisions. I recently appeared in an upcoming documentary for WWE. And when I was talking to one of the WWE employees, I asked him how the dressing room was different. And he said, well, Vince had his office and the guys would wait outside his office. And Triple H circulates among the talent. But it's inevitable that Triple H will have to lock himself in his office at some stage because he'll never have time to do anything because he'll be besieged. And when he does, then there'll be people who'll say, I sat at TV all day and I couldn't even get a conversation with Triple H. Just like there are wrestlers now who say, I didn't get a text back from Tony Khan and I waited and waited all day. It's, the nature of the beast. And, I'm waiting to see how it all plays out. The last few weeks have been very encouraging for AEW. It seems like Tony Khan has managed to push the scrum to a degree into the background, but there's still a lot that's unresolved.
Right.
We don't know what's going to happen with, the EVPs in CM Punk. And those stories are unfolding. And then there are stories outside of WWE and AEW that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't quite know what those stories are yet. So I kind of want to sit back. I have a very demanding full-time job, and I've been, I write about wrestling for, Inside the Ropes magazine every month. And I've been lately being called a lot to appear in these largely WWE documentaries on both A&E and the Peacock Network.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm observing, and then I'll make the decision about what the next wrestling book will be. But there will be one.
Oh, can't wait. Can't wait. Plenty of options out there. So once again, Keith, tell everybody where they can meet you coming up here in October and where they can purchase your book.
Okay. So for everybody in the New York City area, I will be at my release party Thursday night, October 13th. It will be at Lucky 13 in Brooklyn. If you look it up, Lucky 13 in Brooklyn, you'll find the location. Festivities will start about 8 p.m. And then 2 days later, Saturday, October 15th, I will be signing books at the Wrestling Universe in Queens. Again, you can look that up. COVID-19, and you can find it online. And when you read it, go online and feel free to express your opinion on it, or contact me on social media. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. Tell me what you thought of it. I actually find those insights very valuable.
Yes, and we can't wait to talk with you again in the future once the next book comes out, or the next big project that you do. So thank you again for your time tonight, Keith, and looking forward to talking to you in the future.
Same here. Thank you again, Tanner, for having me on.